Okay, so welcome back to my new video. This video, I'm going to talk about limit ranges object in Kubernetes. So by default, containers can run with unbounded compute resources on Kubernetes clusters. With resource quotas, cluster administrators can restrict resource consumption and creation on a namespace basis. Within a namespace, a pod or a container can consume as much CPU and memory as defined by the namespace resource quota. There is a concern that one pod or container could monopolize all available resources. So a limit range is a policy to constrain these resource allocations to pods or containers in a namespace. So a name or a limit range provides constraints that can enforce minimum and maximum compute resources usage per pod or container in a namespace. Take note, in a namespace. It also helps to enforce minimum and maximum storage requests per persistent volume claim in a namespace. It also helps to enforce a ratio between request and limit for resources in a namespace. So we set by default request or limit for compute resources in a namespace and automatically inject them to containers at runtime. So what is all these things about, all the talking about? If you look at the manifest files, you will see that you have two limit ranges. And then you see the first one is memory minimum maximum demo. And then the limit is a list which has what? Maximum memory resource, which is 1 gig. And then the minimum memory for container is what? 500 megabytes. And then the type is what? Container. And if you look at the other one, we have a limit range called CPU minimum maximum demo. Okay, and then the maximum CPU is what? 800 milli-CPU. And then the minimum CPU is what? 200 milli-CPU, and it's constrained to a container. If you look at the other manifest files, you see that we have two ports. One of them is declaring a port, the kind is port, and then the image is what? Nginx. And then it's requesting for resources limited by the CPU of 800 milli-CPU, and then it's requesting for 500 milli-CPU. And then the other one, you see that is requesting for 500 milli-CPU, and then the other one is what? 1.5 milli-CPU. Okay, so you can see that it's going above the bounds of 800 milli-CPU. Okay, so let's jump into our terminal, and I'm going to demonstrate to you how this limit ranges works. Okay, so I'm in my terminal, and I'm going to check for our Kubernetes clusters, which is already created. So we have kubectl get nodes. Okay, so we have two nodes running in our Kubernetes clusters. And inside this directory, I have 5 files. Okay, so let's look at the first file. So if you look at the first one, CPU constraint.yaml, we have the kind to be what? Limit range. And then the maximum is 800 milli CPU. And then the minimum we are asking for is what? 200 milli CPU. And the type is what? Container. Okay, so let's create this limit range. So what we're going to do is kubectl apply -f CPU constraint.yaml. Okay, so before we start, you see, once we create it, it's asking that our namespace limit range not found. Okay, so what we are going to do is we are going to create a namespace. So it's so limit range is more of a namespace constraint. Okay, so it only applies to namespaces. So we have kubectl create namespace. We're calling it YouTube. So it's been created, and then we can make use of this namespace. We're going to say kubectl config set context. The current namespace is what we're going to call it YouTube. Okay, namespace created. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply the CPU constraint.yaml file, and then we specify, we don't have to, but let me try what we're going to get. So we're going to specify the namespace to be YouTube. So you see, limit range is created. So I'm going to say kubectl, let me get the files first. So I'm going to say kubectl get limit range. So as you can see, we have CPU min max demo. So our limit range is created. Okay, so let's describe kubectl get limit range CPU min max demo. We want to output this as what? A YAML. So as you can see in our definition file, we didn't specify any default CPU limit, but Kubernetes was smart enough to define these default values for us. Okay, and you see the max that we defined was 800, and then the minimum that we defined was 200 milli CPU. Okay, so that is our limit range. Okay, so now let's open this CPU constraint port 1. Okay, so I'm going to cut this YAML file. When we cut this YAML file, what we are saying is that we are creating a port with the name constraint CPU demo. And then the image is what? Nginx. And then it's requesting for 500 milli CPU. And then the limit is what? 800 milli CPU. So as you can see here, we are looking for minimum of 200. And this port is requesting 500 milli CPU. So there's not going to be any problem since this is the minimum and this is the maximum. Okay, so this port is still within the range of 200 and 500. So let's create that. I'm going to say kubectl apply -f. So as you can see, the constraint CPU demo created. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to check for the port, get ports. You see, the port is running because this port was able to meet the limit range or the threshold of 200 to 500. Okay, so if you define any limit between 200 and 800, it should be fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say kubectl describe limits, describe port. See, if we describe the port, you see it's requesting for 500 milli CPU, and then the limit is what, 800 milli CPU. Okay, so that is that. Let me clear the screen. And now let's try the second YAML file. So we're going to say cat CPU constraint port -2. So what we are doing here is that we are requesting for 500 milli CPU, and then we're setting the maximum to 1.5 milli CPU. Remember, our limit was what, 800. So it's like we are going above the maximum threshold. Okay, so if I apply this, let's see what we're going to get. Apply -f -f, and we are looking at 2. Okay, and then if I run this, you see the error message that we're getting. It says what? Forbidden. Maximum CPU usage per container is 800 milli CPU, but limit is what? 1500 milli CPU. Okay, so because of the limit that we set for our containers, it's like we are going above the threshold, so it's going to yell at us. So let's look at the third one, the third YAML file, and see what the content is. I'm going to say cat3. So what we are doing here is that we are requesting for 100 milli CPU, and then the maximum is what, 800. But remember that our minimum you can request for was what, 200, and then the maximum was what, 800. So if we are requesting below the threshold, what do you think is going to happen? Okay, I give you some few seconds to get the answer yourself. So let's run this. kubectl, so number 3. So you see the error. It said, well, forbidden. Minimum CPU usage for usage per container is 200 milli CPU, but request is what, 100 milli CPU. Okay, so you can see that it has violated the minimum threshold that we set for our containers inside the YouTube namespace. Okay, so let's look at the fourth one. Let's cut number 4. And you see, this is just the Nginx image, and then the kind is what, a port. We haven't specified any constraints on the, or request for any resources like the CPU. So if we run this number 4, let's see what we're going to get. It should be fine because we let Kubernetes determine the default values for us. kubectl apply -f. So if I run this, you see the port is being created because we didn't specify any limit. It was created as usual. That is what most of the ports we create. We don't mostly specify the resource limits or the limit ranges, but Kubernetes is able to use the default values for us. So let's see the ports that we have. You see, we have 2 ports running because these 2 ports did not violate the limit range. Okay, so let's describe this pod and see what we have. kubectl describe pod hyphen. Okay, let me do the demo first. You see, this is the limit, and then the request is what 500 milli CPU. If we do for the fourth one, you see, because we didn't specify any value or request for resources, Kubernetes used the default values, which is 800 milli CPU, and then 800 CPU. It's requesting for 800 milli CPU, and then the limit is for 800 milli CPU. Okay, so let's see what else we can do. So we can also describe the limit range, describe limit range. So you see, if we describe the limit range, it says, well, the type is what container, and then the resource we are looking at is the CPU, and then the minimum is 200 milli CPU and the maximum is 800 milli CPU. The default that Kubernetes sets for us is what 800 milli CPU and then 800 maximum. Okay, so basically, if you don't specify any resources, Kubernetes uses this default values. So if you want to apply this same technique to your memory, you just have to let me see which one I can use. This is the pod. Okay, I don't want the pod. Cat. So if you don't want the CPU, you only have to specify, in place of CPU, specify memory, and then you make sure that you give the right units, like let's say megabytes, gigabytes, and things like that. You specify them in here, and that should also work for ports. So if you are concerned about the memory utilization, you go with, or you are concerned about both of them, then you can create memory as well as what CPU limit ranges. Okay, so I think that is all for this video. If you have any question, please leave your question in the comment section below, and then I'll try as much as possible to get back to you. And don't forget also to like the video, share, and subscribe. It's very important. Thank you. See you in the next one.